just a minute ago to Dave Quinn that I may have a high bar today, but you all have an even higher bar. This is a paper that I have been working on for far too long. It's at its third round of AERJ. I purposefully did not send back the most recent version, waiting to see if there were any other things that I might learn from this group. I'm not going through one more round of review. I will strangle the editor or myself. So this paper is called Ben and Scott, How Tie Formation and Partnership Networks Gives High Schools Differential Access to Social Capital. This is a research stream that is related to a lot of my research, which I'll actually spend time talking about. What I would like in terms of the format for our conversation is that you should feel free at any time to raise your hand and ask me a question of clarification or to push me a little bit on conceptualization or on the methods. The way that I like to organize my talks is to try and make sure I am speaking to as many people as possible with respect to the problem or phenomenon and how it might get conceptualized and the way that I'm actually trying to solve my problem. But that may mean the things that you need or are most interested in aren't getting pushed on hard enough. And if that's the case, push me a little bit and we'll dive deeper. Are those okay, Williams? Alrighty. So, here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk a little bit about my background and perspective. Why am I studying this thing at all? Two, I'm going to spend our time talking about this theory of action that undergirds partnerships or why we think it's a good policy, and whether or not that theory makes as much sense as we think it does. The third thing that I'm going to do is think very carefully about the structure, meaning the social network structure of these relationships. And if I do a good job, I hope we have enough time so there's some open discussion to talk about implications. Those are the four things we're going to accomplish. Here is the bit on my perspective and what I'm doing studying this work. So I actually came to my research stream and my kind of interest in organizations trying to figure out why is it so difficult to get schools to actually implement the kinds of policies that we know need to be implemented in order to improve them. My background actually is in public policy, but I ended up getting a degree in organizations after I spent time working in a school and realized many of the things that I saw on a daily basis as having an impact on the work, my own as a teacher and on the students, had much less to do with policy and more to do with organizations. The more that I studied organizations, I found myself drawn to this set of ideas around institutions, what it is about institutions that makes them persist, and one of the most well-known scholars in this area is Richard Scott. He actually talks about 3 reasons, or pillars as he describes them, for why institutions persist. One of those pillars are pillars that he describes as the cognitive pillar, but really that means the kind of schema and scripts people have about what are the appropriate ways to do work in this organization. And as a consequence of those embedded ways of thinking, it's very difficult for them to even conceptualize other ways to do their work or to agree with changes people might want to make to those ways of doing work. Another pillar is this pillar that he calls the normative pillar. That's really about the sets of relationships people have in their organizations that reinforce certain ways of working. And they reinforce them because people get social rewards from their interactions with peers. And I mean things like status, legitimacy, trust for going along with the practices of their peers. In my own organization, that's the entire way that academia works. There's peer review and endorsement for the ideas that my peers like. That's my little. Last one is the regulative pillar, which is the sanction. So why do institutions persist? Because really there are rules and regulations in place that actually provide resources or withhold resources for certain types of practices. And that makes it very risky or unrewarding or possibly infeasible to pursue certain courses of action. Most of my work is on this social groups pillar, really thinking about how relationships matter. And that's important because this middle pillar actually is related very closely to both of those other ones, meaning interactions end up having a big implication for the kinds of resources that are available, which is why I'm looking at interactions between partners and schools to try and figure out whether or not those relationships might enable schools to have the resources that they need. So when I say resources schools might need, what I'm talking about are the kinds of resources that, for me, became very salient in one of the first pieces that I ever read about education that, in fact, motivated me to want to study a lot of what I studied. You probably can't see all of this, but what I will do is just read a little bit of it. This is from Jonathan Coles's Savage Inequalities. He writes that the library is a tiny, windowless, and claustrophobic room. I can count approximately 700 books, seeing no reference books. I asked the teacher if encyclopedias and other reference books are kept in the classrooms, and the teacher responds, "We don't have encyclopedias in the classrooms. That's for the suburbs." The school has 26 computers for 1,300 children. There's one small gym. The children get one period, sometimes two of recess. But there is no actual playground. And there's no Head Start in District 10. The school is 90% Black and Hispanic, 10% are Asian, white, and Middle Eastern. The social studies walls are bare of decorations. There seems to be no ventilation, or if one exists, it isn't working. So when I'm talking about resources, I'm talking about everything from physical resources like books, but space, the building and the way that it's maintained, but I'm also talking about the kinds of resources students might need, like technology. So the idea here is that schools don't have the resources that they need to help students do well, especially certain types of students. This is a school in the Bronx. And that understanding about the need for schools to have more resources was partly what drove the Educational Partnership Act in 1988. And the idea behind this act was that, as we see highlighted here in red, in order to apply the resources, so we're going to have this great act, so that we can apply the resources of private and nonprofit sectors to the community, to the need of the community, to the needs of elementary and secondary schools. So the theory of action here is that if there are schools that need resources, like the one we saw in the Bronx, and we create policies that encourage partnerships between schools and other organizations, the resources of those sectors will go to the schools that most need the resources. Like, we don't need more resources going to schools that already have resources. The idea is that schools that need resources will get them. That is the theory of action for why we think partnership policies are a good idea. That's the theory of action that I want to interrogate. Like, is that how things work? And if that's not how things work, why not? So I'm just doing a scan, because in my heart I'm still a 6th grade teacher, looking for understanding. All right, here we go. So, the idea of resources that might get provided to schools falls under the broad rubric of what I would describe as social capital. So what you see here is an amalgamation of 3 of the most famous definitions for social capital from Purdue, Coleman, and Lynn. Social capital is the potential and actual set of cognitive resources, so things like information and advice. Social resources, so things like trust and influence. And material resources, things like books and a place to have recess. That are made available through direct and indirect relationships. Social capital is not just about individuals having resources transferred, but also organizations have resources that are transferred through relationships. Well, this is what I just said. Here are some examples of the kinds of resources: material, cognitive, and social. So, if the theory of action is that partnerships will somehow facilitate resources by virtue of the social capital that exists, we should ask the question, who gets partnerships? So a moment ago, we talked about the theory of action. So the basic hypothesis is that schools that need resources most will get the most partnerships. So that means schools that might need resources so that they can have more experienced teachers. That means schools might need resources so they can give support to disadvantaged students, meaning extra support with respect to the curriculum or maybe even social services. Schools that might need support to expose students to vocations and careers, because maybe they live in neighborhoods where they don't see a lot of different people going to different kinds of jobs. Maybe the resources we need are stronger curriculum, ways to somehow support students in achieving more highly, or maybe we just need help in facilities.
Yeah, hi, Ebony. Maybe you explained this earlier, but can I ask, so if the schools that need the resources the most are supposed to get them, what's the policies thinking about how they get it? Do they have to submit an application? Like, does the district do it? Does, because I'm imagining if you're a school that needs more resources, you might not have the capacity to really vouch for your need and get the resources that you need. So I was just curious how the policy works.
So I think this insight that maybe you don't have the capacity to get the resources that you need is partly going to be driving some of the findings we see. But quite frankly, the initial idea behind how schools would do this is they would kind of go out and marshal the people in their community to help them. This, though, was at the very beginning. Increasingly, states and districts are trying to play a role in facilitating partnerships, but the way they're doing that is by saying, here are a list of partners you might choose from, which definitely narrows the kind of, or minimizes the search costs involved in finding partners, but the same mechanism is still at play. Here's the list. It's not 1,000 people, it's 100 people. Figure out who to go to. Great question. Other folks? Okay, so hypothesis one is that schools, so this, I phrase it as a question, schools that need the most resources, but that the hypothesis of the theory of action is that that's who gets resources. This, I guess, makes sense, especially if you're sitting in a policy position, but it actually goes against what people who study social capital know about how social capital works, meaning resources that flow through relationships. Research on social capital indicates that it's often the structure of the network rather than an actor's particular characteristics that determine outcomes. And what I mean by particular characteristics, I mean attributes attributed to someone like the school. So does a school need resources? A school needs more teachers. That's an individual attribute. In a minute, I'll tell you what I mean by the structure of the network. But usually, when we're predicting outcomes with social network theory or with social capital theory, it's the structure rather than the attributes of the actors that matter. So if we're going to rely on social capital theory, my hypotheses, the other ones that I will walk you through, are that really, number one, well, this would actually be number two, these social characteristics are going to matter much more than the resources, and then very particular social characteristics are going to matter. And I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean by particular social characteristics. Because depending on how much time you'd like to spend thinking about social network theory, what I mean by network structure may mean different things to you. So I'm just going to step through it very quickly. As I watch your faces, I will slow down or speed up, depending on that. So usually when we think about relationships, we think about a relationship between two people, like Alice and Bill, or organization, alliance for better schools, and better alliance for schools, A and B. But when we're talking about relationships, one of the things we want to recognize is that it's not just this dyadic link, the ties between two actors that matter. These actors are embedded in a larger pattern of relationships. So this actor B has relationships to C and E and D. And depending on this broader pattern, it has implications for what resources different actors can access. So for example, if you're actor A, it's much harder to get resources from E or D or C, because in order to get those resources, you have to go through that person in the middle, B. So when I'm talking about structure of the network, I'm talking about a pattern that looks like this, but I could also be talking about a pattern like this, where now there's a relationship that's direct between A and C. And not only does it matter what the pattern of the relationship looks like, it matters what position you have. So if I'm A here, that's a very different position than if I'm A here. So when I'm talking about the structure of the network, I'm actually talking about not just who the actors or nodes are, not just the relationship that exists between any two actors, but the overall pattern of relationship that exists amongst the sets of actors. And there are actually 4 particular patterns that I'm interested in. Those hypotheses that I was talking about, the hypothesis 2 was that structure would matter more than resources. But I'm also going to look at the strength of a relationship. So in a moment I'll talk about how I measure strength. But that basically means how strongly tied two actors are. I'll also talk about how dense these relationships are. And that basically means, are all the possible ties that could exist, have they actually been actualized? So it's about the proportion of relationships that exist. I'll also look at how central an actor is in the network. So whether or not you are A on the outside or A on the inside. And I'll look at how similar a position you have in the network matters. And what I want to say about this similar position construct is important, because the author who kind of created this set of ideas about the importance of structural equivalence is someone who's interested in competition. Meaning, what does the network structure look like when different actors have to compete for the same resource? So for example, I'm sorry people may not be able to see in the back. Similar positions, what you see here are sets of actors who, in order to get to the same third actor, have to go through similar channels. So if you're one of these actors down here who are in the same position, meaning there's a similar pattern of relationships, K and L have to go through this person in the middle, I and J have to go to this person in the middle, and both of those people have to figure out how to get to Z. When you're in a similar position, like these folks down here or these folks down here, it suggests you are in competition to get to this person at the top, because Z, this person at the top, may not be able to equally allocate time, resources, attention to all of you all. So this measure of similarity is really a measure of the degree of competition that might exist in the pattern of relationships. So in a minute, I'm going to go to the next slide, because these are very basic patterns. This is the pattern of the school partner network in 1999 when I started this study. So before we talk about the complications of this network structure, I just want to make sure we're all set here.
So do you also look at the characteristics of the actors in the particular node? So it seems like if someone were a particular kind of enabler, then being in a central node position, they could actually be more facilitative than a direct connection with a shorter path length, for example. So is that something you look at, or you only look at the structure of the network?
So I look at the characteristics of the nodes in two ways. One more intensely in the next study. So I do know what industry each partner is in. So for example, one might expect if you're a partner that is in the education industry, you'd be much better at facilitating certain resources to different kinds of schools than if you were Borough President Marty Markowitz, who is in fact listed as a partner in the study. However, in a follow-up study that I'm working on, I actually have measures of the actual activities. Well, I have a proxy measure of the actual activities in which partners are involved by searching their websites and coding the text on the websites. But that's not in this study. Okay. But I am interested in that question. Tune in 5 years from now when that paper gets published. Okay. Sorry, I'm so bitter. The review process makes you very bitter. Moving on. Here's the structure of the network. Anybody else? So this study takes place from the 1999-2000 school year to the 2005-2006 school year. It might be a little bit harder to see here, but some of these dots are circles and they're orange. Some of these dots are squares and they're blue. The blue squares are partners. The orange dots are schools. The reason you see some of these dots and circles on the side is because these represent partners or schools who are in the data set but don't exist in the 1999-2000 school year. The size represents how many they are. I think it's 17. I think each one of these is 17. That tells you how many partners come into the study after 1999 and how many schools come into the study after 1999. All right. So, quick overview of the research methods. This is 211 New York City high schools. This is all publicly available data. In fact, you'll see this in a minute. I'll just keep talking. 211 New York City high schools, 1,098 unique partner organizations from 1999 to 2005. The way that I identify these partner organizations is publicly available data. The schools used to produce these things called annual school reports. They don't do this anymore. They do it another way. But on these annual school reports, they're required to report community support, where they list the organizations that they're supposed to be partnered with. I make sure to double check with the DOE to find out, are the people these schools list partnerships, and to make sure that we're actually talking about the same set of types of relationships, and the answer was yes. So when you think about all the partners that were listed over these years, that's how I end up with these 1,098 unique partners in 211 high schools. Also, these reports provide lots of information on the schools, like what proportion of teachers are experienced, how much money they spend on their school budgets. I also collect data from other sources. So the New York City, what's it called? The Council of something, it might be down here somewhere. New York City Corporate City of
City Planning.
Thank you. I'm glad you all can read that. Getting old also makes you bitter. So I collect data also on neighborhood statistics, where neighborhood in this study is proxied by census tract. That's not a perfect measure of neighborhood. It's the best that I can do. One of the nice features of having data from this source as well as from the annual school reports is that I can actually instrument some of the measures that I have, so I don't have to worry about all the data coming from just one place. And then finally, I was actually just saying this to you a moment. What was your name?
Mary Helen.
Mary Helen, a moment ago, about how I can go to the websites for each of the partners. For partners that didn't have websites, I had to go to the Gale Encyclopedia of Associations and Nonprofits and look up what they actually did. They described the activities. I only used this data in this study to figure out the industry for the partners. So, when you take all those high schools and all those partners, you end up with over 200,000 observations a year and over 1 million observations over the whole sample. That seems like great, lots of data, but all that data, most of which, so even though there's all that data, most of the observations in that data are 0. Meaning what this data is all schools and all partners, and the cell is, do they have a tie? Most schools and most partners don't have ties. Having all those zeros is a bad thing for actual analysis. My analytical sample is a random sample of 7 unobserved partnerships. That's following a lot of the literature that looks at partnership formation, but I do examine other samples to make sure that the results are robust to that, and the answer is yes.
So I was just curious as to why did you choose high school and why did you choose New York?
Yeah.
To focus your analysis.
So New York, I chose, so I was going to say it and realize how strange it sounded. I love New York. I was like, wait a minute, isn't that a catchphrase? No, so it's a city that I spend a lot of time studying, so I understood the context very well. I actually was surprised at myself that I chose high schools. This is the only study that I have that isn't in the K through 8 context. And one of the reasons, there are 2 reasons I chose high schools. There was much more reliable data on the annual school reports. The elementary schools seem to do stranger things. Sometimes they did. In fact, I don't think I have a slide for this. I was going to say, so sometimes they did an annual report, sometimes they didn't. I did a non-respondence analysis, so schools that didn't submit an annual school report. And those schools, there were 3 big differences. One is that the schools that didn't submit a report were more likely to be in the Chancellor's District, which was the special district of schools that couldn't get their act together. Schools were less likely to submit an annual school report at the beginning of the study than at the end of the study. And in a minute, you'll see why, in terms of where partnerships start to increase. It's actually very closely related to No Child Left Behind. And what was the third characteristic? I have the paper over there. There's some third characteristic that describes the non-responses that I can't remember. So yeah, high school convenience, partly interest, which I guess is also a form of convenience.
Right. I mean, can you explain a little bit about the data too? So you're able to observe if schools are nominating a partner, like a partner organization, but are you also able to observe if the partner organizations are nominating schools? No, so it's just like it's one directed from the schools to these partners.
I presume, the way I model it, I presume it's bi-directional, meaning that the value in the cell is the same for the nominators, the schools, as the nominatees, but I just presume that the value is the same.
Yeah, because you couldn't actually ask the partners, right? Okay.
Except some, not in this journal, so this is also a story of the review process, some reviewers did want me to go back and try to interview some of the people who actually put these partnerships together, which I tried to do because I'm a good scholar. But it turns out that people in 2011 or 12 have absolutely no idea who did what in 1999. Thank you. Okay. So what's the model that I run here? So what we have basically are schools and partners, but we have different schools mapped to different partners over time. Because I'm also trying to predict, is there a partnership, yes or no, I'm going to use a logistic model. I'm going to use a cross-classified multi-level model, but I'm looking at 3 DVs. One of them is there a partnership, yes or no? Another one is this the first year of a partnership? So partnership emergence. Another one is there a partnership in the future? So this basic kind of mixed model formulation is what I'm looking at with 3 different DVs. For people who don't like this formulation, this model basically answers the question, what's the probability, meaning the log odds in this particular setup, that a school will have a partnership, emerge in the future, given certain school characteristics, like their resource needs, given certain partner characteristics like the industry, given certain network characteristics like tie strength, social network features, and then I also have controls for the distance between a school and a partner, like the physical distance in miles, also school size. Yes, hello.
Hi. Were you able to, it seems like when people were seeking out partnerships, there wasn't necessarily a structured way to do that. Were you able to see at all who was tasked with creating the partnerships and whether that had an influence on the amount made?
I think what you mean is, who was the person that actually had to go out and ask for a
Right, so was it the principal, was it a resource
This is
coordinator?
exactly what the reviewer that I was describing a minute ago wanted me to do, like find out what people were doing. So one virtue of a huge data set like this is that I have a fairly high degree of confidence that what I'm finding is fairly generalizable. It doesn't give me the kind of fine-grained data that we might actually want to have about what was actually going on in those partnerships. And there actually is a lot of qualitative work looking at school partnerships. In this paper, I draw a lot on the work of Mavis Sanders, who looks at these kinds of issues. One of the things you'll see that I'll show you, I think, from the follow-up analyses that we'll find is that when school resources matter, spoiler alert, you all already knew that, when school resources matter, it turns out the biggest effect is whether or not there's a new principal. So that kind of tells you something. Okay. All right. So I always just like to make what the takeaways are up front. Like I don't like it to be like a suspense novel, like let's wait and find out who the killer was. These are what you should, this is what you should take away, and we will walk through whether or not you should believe these 3 takeaways by looking at the findings. So what I think my findings suggest are 1, that schools that may have the greatest resource needs are less likely to have partnerships. 2, schools in the most advantageous network positions are most likely to have partnerships. So most advantageous means it might be easier to reach them given their position. It might be easier to reach them given how long they've already had a partnership. And then 3rd, network structure, not resources, explain more variation in school partnerships. So if you're trying to understand why does a school have a partner, it has very little to do with the resources they need and a lot more to do with where they are in that network and what the pattern of those relationships are. Now we can see how much you buy this on the next slides. So, hold on please. I said a minute ago we could take a look at the pattern of partnerships. So this is over time. You can see at the beginning of the study, not much was going on. Well, not much I guess isn't exactly right. So this is partnership ties as a proportion of something. I have to remember what it is. I'm looking at what the scale is. Give me a minute to think about it. What you should notice is that here is where there's a spike, and that spike is in 2001, 2002, which is basically when No Child Left Behind started, and the federal government said it would be a great idea if you all had partnerships, and the school said, okay, we'll have partnerships. This is the distribution of partners by industry. This is horribly hard to see. So this is the biggest block. It's partners who were in educational services. This is arts, entertainment, and recreation, so the kids get to go to the museum. This is healthcare and social services, so there are hospitals that are nearby that schools might have relationships with. This one is other services, so things that aren't healthcare, so it might be things like lawyers, it might be, there was a mechanic listed on there, maybe the school had a bus, I'm not really sure what that was about. And then this is all other industries besides the ones you see here. Okay. Oh, yes.
Sorry, just to go back to that, we would, like youth advocacy or political organizations, would that be part of all other?
That would be part of other services. Not, so all other industries are things like, let me see if I can remember a few examples. I think Marty Markowitz was under there. Bobby Brown Cosmetics. What? Maybe someone knew Bobby Brown. Let's see. And this is Bobby Brown, the makeup lady, not every. Yeah. So in fact, I will tell you in a minute. I actually have a list in that paper. I have a list of the most central partners in schools, and I'll take a look at afterwards and we can see who those are. Okay. So I'm just going to walk back here to see how hard it is actually to see those things. And that's what we know. Wow, it's like impossible. Okay, so I'll walk through it. So, what you are looking at is a list of the key variables. These variables in white are the school resource needs. At the top, it's teachers with more than 5 years of experience. Thank you. How's that? Much better. It's teachers with more than 5 years of experience. The idea being here that schools that have fewer experienced teachers have greater resource needs in terms of needing help to get more teachers. I think I don't have to walk through these now, right? Can you see them? Mm-hmm. Okay. In the blue, these are the school partner network characteristics. So it's centrality, the strength of the partner relationship, and strength measure here, this is the measure everyone hates. It's the best I can do with this data. It's actually the number of years a partnership exists. I recognize that that is not the best measure of strength, meaning maybe you have a partner for 1 year and that partner transforms the way the school works. That might arguably be a much stronger partnership than a partnership you've had for 5 years and you just put it on that list and they never did anything. But my measure of strength here is, oh, in fact, I meant to do that way back there. Oh, I don't know how to make this thing work. So I think, is it here? Yeah, I should have done this back there. So you can see the actual measures. Teacher experience, percent of teachers teaching more than 5 years. You see the data source over there. Student body endowment is the percent of students receiving free and reduced lunch. Neighborhood characteristics are the median family income in the school census tract, transformed, as the measures transform because it's totally not normal. Sorry, I had plenty in my mind. Non-academic supports, so what are the kinds of resources that you might need to provide to students that are not related to academics? I proxy those in 3 ways. Maybe you need to give them resources so they can have more recreational experiences. You all remember that savage inequalities thing from the very beginning. That measure is the distance to 3 major recreational facilities that exist in New York, the JCC, the YMCA, and the New York City Rec Department. I tested 1 mile and 10 miles. 5 miles actually ended up being one of the better measures, partly because the maximum distance for the relationship to these kinds of partners, I think was like 2.4 or something like that. So things that were longer, further away than 5, they basically didn't exist. So many of them were within 1 mile, but that didn't work very well. So 5 miles is what I use. Mean distance to identified health and social service facilities, so things like hospitals. Oh, I should have talked about this one. So remember I said that one of the resources I was interested in was whether or not the school needed to provide additional resources to expose students to vocation and careers. The way that I proxy that is with this index that's used in the organizations literature a lot for occupational diversity. It's actually a diversity measure for lots of things, but often used for occupational diversity. And what it basically looks at, so what I did was I could look at every census tract and see how many occupations in that census tract, industries there were in that census tract, and then I could create this metric or this index that said, how diverse is this census tract with respect to the distribution of industries as a proxy for how many occupations the students in that census tract might be exposed to. Curriculum quality, another poor measure, but I don't think quite as bad as the other one, at least in terms of conceptualization. Do you have a good curriculum? I'm going to proxy totally by the percent of students that score well on the English language arts exam. This is passing the English language arts regents. I also looked at math. They were basically equivalent. I flipped a coin between the two. Some people think that I should use the average. Some people, who am I talking about? I didn't use the average because one of the things I want to do is describe substantively what the results of this study are, and I find it easier to do with an actual measure than with averages. And then resources on facilities and non-instructional supplies, percent of budget spent on building services. I should have done that slide a long time ago, I apologize.
Let's have a question. So this percent of students passing the English Regents exam, so does that take into account English language learners?
Yes. What I could have done. In fact, I've tested a few measures like this. I know from those reports that there are, I know the percentage of students receiving free and reduced lunch. I know the percentage of ELL students, and I have this metric for how little money there might be. I did try to look at a factor approach to resources, so instead of looking at individual resources, so these resources came from looking at the literature over time and trying to figure out what are the ones that matter most. I took a factor approach, and it turned out because it was coming from different data sources, the factor was basically explaining the different data sources and not the resources, so I just let that go. So unfortunately, this thing, so going back to the results. Okay. School resource needs, the ones I just talked about. Here are the school partner network characteristics, things like centrality, the strength, the density of a partnership, but I also look at density squared. So density squared is a measure that's basically looking at, okay, so there's a lot of the relationships that could have been realized have been realized, high density. So if you have high density, maybe it's easier to get to lots of partners because your partners have lots of relationships. But density squared basically looks at, if I look at the increase in density, so not just is there high density, is density increasing? Because maybe it's actually bad to have too dense of a network because all those people are talking to each other, or it's a lot to manage all these interactions. So I put in density squared to try and look at the effect of the increasing rate of density. Equivalence in the partnership network. So is a school in an equivalent position? Remember, that's the measure for competition. We see in red the industries. Here's this distance between the schools and partners as a control. The variance structures down there at the bottom, the log likelihood, the adjusted R-squared, and how many observations there are. Based on that analytical sample of 72,009.
And what do you mean by, is it centrality of the school or of the partner?
It is the centrality of the school.
So how are you observing that? Because no one's, do schools get to nominate each other too, or?
So there are school nominations, but the data is all schools and partners, all schools and partners. So I know based on the indirect ties between partners and schools. So me and Ross and Mary Helen. I know Ross. Ross knows Mary Helen.
Yeah.
I can look through indirect relationships to see how central I am, even though I don't know, even though I'm not necessarily directed to Mary Helen. Which I am. We've had many conversations with her. All right, so what seems to matter? This is the model with no network characteristics in it. So when you have no network characteristics, it seems like those resources do not seem to matter for whether or not a school has a partner. And this is the model, you can't see that. This is PIJT. This is just, does a partnership exist? Not is it emerging, not is it in the future, does it exist right now? School resources don't seem to matter for that. What does seem to matter is mean distance to recreational facilities, meaning how the closer you are, the more likely you are to have a partnership. Did I do the thing? Yes, good. A school that's 1 mile closer to a YMCA, JCC, or NYC will have significantly increased odds of partnership. So 180, the odds of partnership will increase by 186%. This next model is the model that has the school partnership variables in there. 2 things that I think are important to point out right away is that once you have these omitted variables, so variables that should have been in there to begin with, but I didn't put them in there because I like to step through my models. Once you put in those omitted variables, you can see a pattern here where it turns out some resources do in fact matter. So teachers, having students who are, have low SES, you're less likely to have a partner. Having schools where a higher proportion of kids who pass the English Regents are less likely to have partners, so that could be ostensibly a good sign. Here, the more money you spend on your budget, the more likely you are to have a partner. And then here, strength of a partner relationship. So this ends up being one of the largest predictors. So 2 things I want to say. The strength of a partnership, remember, is how long you've had a partner. So what this is basically saying is, having had a partner in the past is the hugest predictor. So huge, in fact, okay, it's not in the right order, I'll come back. So huge, in fact, I'll do here. If you've had a partner for at least 3 years, you are basically guaranteed to have that partner. So that's what this number says. So I'll come back to it in a moment, but this idea about what matters for a partnership and who gets a partner, part of what explains who gets a partner is whether or not you've already had partners. Let me go back here. Another thing that I want to point out is, look how much more of the variation in this model is explained by adding the network variables. So here the pseudo R-squared is 0.0052. Here it's 0.6469. That's actually a pretty huge increase for a model that has just archival data in it from many, many years ago. 10% more SES. A school with 10% more low SES students than otherwise similar schools have a 4.78% lower odds of having a partnership. I think I do this again down here. Each additional partner a school shares with another partner. Oh, so this is the school equivalence measure. Each additional partner a school shares with another school. So remember that measure of competition. So Ross and Mary Ellen both want to, what's your name? Partner with Khalif. The more Mary Helen and Ross at another school, the more of schools there are all trying to get to Khalif, the less likely Ross or Mary Ellen is to have a partner. In fact, each additional person who gets added to that makes the school 99.89% less likely to partner. The premise being of this metric is because they're competing to get to Khalif. Just did that one. Okay, so this is the model looking at partnerships emergence. So it's not, do I have a partner? Is this the first year I have a partner? This is the same pattern of results except one that I wanted to point out. There's no strength of a partner relationship because no partners have existed yet. Basically the same pattern. This one is the model for whether or not you have a partnership in the future. So there's two things that I want to point out here. One is that notice that whereas having teachers with more experience mattered when a partnership was emerging, and when you ask, do you have a partner right now, it doesn't matter when you are actually predicting future partnerships. The same thing is true for competition. What that suggests to me is that it's this kind of model, this tournament model, meaning having a lot of teachers might help you initially get, having a lot of high quality teachers, I argue, might help schools get partners. Maybe they have relationships out in the community. But once schools have those partnerships, whether teachers have helped them get those partnerships or whether they've competed for them, once they've got the partnerships they have, having a lot of experienced teachers or having to compete doesn't have an effect because you basically got those partners and you hold on to them until death, which is why that effect for partner strength was so high. Yes, Kate.
Quick question. So it looks like you have 71,000 observations in Model 4 and 9,600 in Model 5.
Yes.
So I'm looking at your magnitude, and I don't know quite how to interpret it, but the magnitude of the coefficient on like the school equivalents, and you still had a pretty big magnitude, just that it's less precise. Is that because of the observation?
I think it's because no matter what you do, there are so many zeros in this data set that you get pretty strong effects. I do get the exact same effects when I literally match partner and observed partnership with an unobserved partnership so that there's 1 0 for every one and you get the exact same effects. So I have decided that what's going on here is because the effects of having a partner are so strong, meaning the likelihood of doing it is so rare that when you get an effect it really works. But the fact, now that I'm talking through with you, that you get the same effects when there's even only 1 0, think through that.
Yeah.
We have lunch, right?
Yes, we do.
Exactly. Take some notes. Other questions? And I did also want to point out for people who are wondering, the reason there are so few observations in Model 5 is because this is predicting future partnerships. So the only observations that are in this particular model are observations of partners that have, you had to have had a partnership to begin with to have a future partner. So it reduces the number of observations in the model substantially. Okay. So I was was rushing a little bit through those findings, which I apologize for, because I wanted to get to the end so we can have a conversation, and then we can go back to things that you might like to. So what do I think are the implications of these results? So that finding that we saw about partner strength, schools that don't already have partners are going to have the most trouble getting partners, because that means a strength measure basically means if you've got a partner, it's easier to get one. If you don't have a partner already, it's harder to get one. Schools that most need resources are less likely to get resources. So in fact, let's go back here to the percent budget. There's percent of school budget. So here, the more money you spend on your budget, you think that you would end up having the more money you spend on your budget, you would think that going out and having partners would let you spend less money on your budget. But it turns out for that metric and others, I may have misread that. Did I make the right
Facilities.
Thank you, facilities. Thank you, percent spent on facilities. You would think that having a higher percent of your budget spent on facilities would suggest that I have a lot of resources here to just throw away on partners, and so to throw away on facilities. And so you shouldn't have more partnerships necessarily. Unless special supports are provided to the most disadvantaged schools, advocating partnerships may only serve to reinforce existing structural inequalities. A famous sociologist, any sociologists in the room? Shout out to Robert Martin, nobody knows who he is. He coined this term called the Matthew effect. For unto everyone that hath shall be given, and he's from the Bible, he shall have in abundance, but for him that hath not shall be taken even that which he hath. I love the Bible. King James is great. I think this says it in just the same way that easier. Hence the title of the paper. Them that Scott shall have, them that's not shall lose. This is the point that I wanted to make earlier on about the role of the principal. I didn't show this in the findings, just because of the way the slides are set up. But when I do, because I have these annual school reports over time, I can look at the name of the principal on each report. When the principal's name changes from year to year, I count that as turnover. So having a new principal, when the principal turns over, and one might argue, a new principal is more motivated because they're in there, they want to do a good job. The odds of partnership increases by 27.32%. It's one of the biggest effects. The effect is larger than any of the school resources, but that effect is still much smaller than any of the network effects structures. So I think that's the end. Yes, and now we can go back to and talk about it. Can I have a light, please, just so I can see the people I'm talking to? Hello.
Sorry I was late. So in 1997, 98, I had an opportunity to Metro Center to implement safety.
Alan, can you speak up just a bit?
In 97 and 98, I was at the Metro Center in Harmon, and we implemented Safe and Drug-Free School grant to the city's schools, right? And as we were distributing the resources, we were kind of pulled aside and said, hey, these resources are going to go during the safe, which supports your So 9/11 happened shortly thereafter. The city's changed, gentrification.
That's interesting.
I wonder if those patterns come out in there.
Huh. So I have been attributing this spike to No Child Left Behind. Could it be a 9/11?
Well, I mean, the city, not 9/11 itself, but just since 9/11.
Well, this is New York City.
Well, no, but I'm saying, but not just 9/11 as an event, but the changes in gentrification, like look at Brooklyn now.
Yeah.
Brooklyn then.
Yeah, it could have been all of that could have been true.
So,
I have been saying it's No Child Left Behind, but all of those are equally plausible explanations. I'll see if I can squeeze that into my discussion section.
Yeah, I know I was actually building on Alan's point. First of all, this is fascinating. Thank you for this. It could be that, the spike around No Child Left Behind, around 2001. I just had a senior moment and forgot.
I had two during the presentation. I'm not sure how well I covered them, but you're entitled.
Will you circle back to me?
Sure, of course.
So you started with institutional theory. Can you bring us back and say what are the implications of your findings for institutional?
I would love to, because in fact, this them that's got shall have idea. So remember at the beginning I was talking about how these regulative, normative, and cognitive pillars hold institutions in place. So regulative pillars were the rules and policies that kind of provide resources or not. This setup basically says we have a policy that's created in a way that requires people to go out, this was your question, and seek resources. But you don't have access to the full possible range of partners. You only have opportunities for partnerships with the ones you see as available or are actually available. So that suggests that if you want to actually change institutional patterns, meaning make sure schools that need resources actually get them, you don't say, go out, good luck, find a partner. You identify the schools that may be least likely to have partners. A better way to do that is by actually mapping the network. This is all data the schools have. You could use resources as a proxy, but my study shows it's not really the resources that are constraining them. And actually provide targeted services to schools to help them find partnerships. And that doesn't mean invite them all into one room with the partners and say, they're all in this one room. Because if my finding about competition is right, putting them all in the same room to fight over Marie Helen will just get you right back here. It's about facilitating sets of relationships that will help change the pattern of resource allocations that are currently holding the same kinds of institutions in place over time, which is basically those schools where there are lots of poor kids who might need help, not actually get, where the savage inequality kids still don't have a library or a playground or books.
Okay, now I'm back. So, No Child Left Behind, you said that there was a spike there, and I think I heard you say because No Child Left Behind encouraged partnerships. And so I think what I heard was that you were referencing something explicit in the design of the law that encouraged partnerships.
Correct.
And yet I think I would say most of us, when we think about No Child Left Behind, that aspect of the law doesn't come to mind, right? It's all the other things that were happening around No Child Left Behind that might not be characterized as partnerships per se. So I'm wondering how you think about sort of the directive influence of No Child Left Behind as a sort of formal policy. There was no bite to that aspect of the law. So how did you come to that?
So my thinking follows two trains of thought. So in the law, there is language that says this is going to be hard for you to do, go out and find partners. Maybe that was an impetus. But what I think is a bigger impetus is the fact that the schools at the beginning were held to such strict levels of accountability, meaning you better do well or get school in need of improvement. That the schools said, we better get some help around here, and they ran out to get partnerships. That is what but I have no proof of that.
Well, here's something to think about, is that there are other studies and findings that provide some confirming evidence about the relationship between the accountability demands and some of the kinds of organizational relationships that schools form. So, I'm not.
Because I know I don't have lunch with you again. I will follow up by email. I will remember, follow up with Patricia to ask about those other studies. Hopefully my next senior moment will not wipe that encoding from my brain.
Thank you so much for this. It's really interesting. In talking about the effect that the principals have in bringing in a new faculty, I was thinking about that a lot of social ties, they aren't built from scratch every iteration. And like you said, you marked a 0 or 1 depending on if it was a new name. But it would have been interesting to look at the connections and partnerships that principal names already possessed at their previous site to see if they were just restructuring the networks relative to their old network, to see if there's a relationship between within the system, if distance can still be stretched because of an existing relationship.
I think that's a great approach. In fact, Susanna Loeb and Min Young, and third person's name I should remember, because I hate to not be remembered when I co-author a paper, but I can't remember the person's name. They have a paper looking at whether or not having experienced teachers matters. Do you know this paper? And whether experienced teachers matter. And what they do is they have a longitudinal data set like this, and they actually track teachers' movements across time to different schools to see if those teachers are basically importing their experience into the new schools. I think this is a similar argument, but for partnerships. It took a lot of work for me to build this data set. I'm going to write one more paper on it because I'm sick of it, but the data is there. For those of you who say, this seems like interesting data, I should write a paper with evidence. Send me an email. I will probably send you the data. Other folks? Oh, yes, that's true. I should invite. Would anyone like to? We have 3 minutes, so that means if I do not see you after today, this is your last 3 minutes to ask the questions you might want to ask. In the back.
How would an organization like an umbrella organization like New York Cares kind of fit into your data? Because I know that they provide a lot of different resources to like schools, and also like they're kind of like I guess they might just be like that connector, like that A, B, but then having all those connections.
Yeah. So if you're asking, like, if an organization like New York Cares is like a social service organization, then it would have been in one of the industries, one of the health and social services industry. I'm going to my bag so I can pull out the paper so I can tell you who some of the most central partners were. It will take me 3 seconds, I promise.
But is the question that they were an intermediary that then had organizations that they...
So the way I can answer the organizations and intermediaries to figure out how central you are, because the more central you are, the more likely you are to be connecting lots of different actors. I doubt when I look in this appendix it will have New York Cares, but I can tell you who some of the most central partners were, which will tell you they were probably intermediarying for a lot of organizations. So for example, 25 most easily reached schools, centrality, densely populated, facing the greatest competition. I'm happy to send anyone the paper if they'd like it to. Partner centrality. So one is this is in 1999-2000, the National Commission for Cooperative Education. Kingsborough Community College, the College Now program. Okay. New York University, my alma mater. They were doing. You were at the Metro Center, right? Maybe this is all you all. Number 5, St. John's University. Number 5 is Midtown Management Group Incorporated. So I'm guessing that's like the, what do you call it, the business
Chamber of Commerce.
Yes, that thing. Senior moment number 3. All right, everybody. There's 1 more minute. Patricia, would you like to have it?
Sure, very briefly. So I think you answered this, but in your data set, you were relying on school records, school agendas, which is self-reported data on the partnerships. And so remind me again how you sort of move beyond the limitations of that.
I don't. I just say these are the limitations. Meaning, the only way I know that a school and a partner have a partnership is if the school says so. Okay. That could mean nothing was happening in that partnership, meaning like they put it on that. Somebody walked into the school one day and said, do you want these 500 stacks of old newspapers? And the principal says, yes, I have a social studies class. And the person walks out and I never see them again, but that shows up on there.
It was a start. It started building a really interesting data set.
Yeah, so I mean, if this were not archival data, what I would have done was go to the schools to find out what's actually going on here. I made what I thought was more than a good faith attempt, and it seemed like it was going to be no bang for my buck. But I'll tell you the next study that I want to do, again, this is also possible, after the one that I'm currently trying to do, looking at partner resources. I would love to know how schools in those different in those different positions in the network, do they use different strategies to try and pursue partnerships? So it wouldn't be with this data, but on a future partnership study, if I could first map the partner network, then identify schools at different positions, and then look qualitatively at, like, well, is this school who's in this really structurally constrained position, where they have to compete a lot, doing different things to get partners than this school that's over here in the most central position? Like, I think that's fascinating, has a lot of implications for what schools might actually do. I think it's a good idea. I haven't gotten here yet.
Sorry, I know that was the last question, but what really helpful for the students is that, do you think of yourself as a mixed methods, like how do you go about, because it seems to me like sometimes you start quantitative and then you go qual, which is that example.
So I'm a phenomenologist, which means I will take any methodological route I need to get to the answer to the question I'm most interested in. So I have a paper in a mixed methods journal, which is both mixing qualitative and quantitative data. The paper I have coming out now in educational evaluation and policy analysis, looking at institutional logics, is a qualitative data analysis of teachers' interpretations. And I then use social networks to try and see where those interpretations might have come from. So that's a mixed methods paper. But then I have some papers that are just all quant. I think the paper that you were using in your class, all qual. What I like most about this job is that I can look at puzzles that I think are important, disentangle to improve schools, and then I have to figure out how can I actually answer that puzzle. For the students in the room, this is something that I love, but it does have a high cost because it means you have to constantly be reinvesting in the methods you might need to know to answer the problem. So I love what I do, but it means my research productivity, I think, is lower than it would be if I just dug into one method and plowed along with it. But that doesn't make me happy. So I'm the kind of person who does what makes her happy. All right.